All right. Last time, if you recall, we took our conversion, our currency conversion web page that was working and made it better. And we made it better by the criteria of maintainability. We saw how, by running just through some scenarios in our mind, we saw how we went from having to change a whole bunch of things if we were to add a new currency, for example, to where we would only change a couple very minimal things. All right, and that's a big improvement. That's you know, if I was going to define what constitutes a good programming practice, I would say a good programming practice is one that creates code that is more maintainable. All right, that is by and large one of the things that again separates an adequate or an okay, or however you want to put it, mediocre program from one that's good. All right. Now we're going to take that a step farther then, because we still have an issue. All right. Let's take a look and let's remind ourselves of the code and let's see if there's any questions about it. And then let's discuss the issue. Run this. And we can convert between a list of currencies. So I can put in an amount, convert it from dollars to pounds, and we get our converted value. If we look at the code here, we'll see that. Oh, this is the old way. I'm going to actually get rid of this code in this example so as to not clutter up. We kept it in there before to just being able to have something to test. But now it's kind of outlived its purposefulness. Now if we look at the new code, the new code calls a function to do it. And that's a step in the right direction. All right. A general rule is you don't want to have tons of code in an event handler. All right. The event handler will typically be what I like to call sort of like boss code. All right. Now again, let's not make snide comments about bosses that we've had in the past or anything about that. But ideally, a boss isn't the person that does all the details of everything. A boss is someone who just manages the show and just runs the show and directs the other folks around. All right, in a perfect world, anyhow. So in this case, our event function is sort of a boss function, right? It doesn't actually do the calculation. What does it do? It gathers the input. In other words, it grabs what it needs to from the screen, or from the different controls. It calls the function that does do the work, and then it does a little bit of math and so on down the line. Now we could probably break this out even more if we wanted to, and when we go into the class stage we'll refactor this even a little bit more. Because really, frankly, I don't really even like this function. I'd much rather have a convert function that got the rate and then did the calculation. In fact, let's go and do that. Let's make a convert function that accepts 3 arguments. What will those 3 arguments be?
Dollar rate, euro rate, pound rate.
No.
From, to, and the rate.
Yeah, well, the amount, the from, and the to.
Right.
So, what I'm going to do is that into there. I changed the name of my function from convert to convert amount simply because there's already something in the language that's called convert, and I don't want to confuse things. There might even be ways for me to qualify that so I could get away with it, but why go there? I'm just going to make sure it has its own name. So convert amount. All right. There's another thing I want to change. All right. 2 things I want to change. I think it's important for you to know why I'm doing this. You may think that the changes I'm doing really doesn't add anything to it, but I think it does. So the one thing I'm going to change is, notice how this function says get rate, drop down selected value, drop down selected value. I'm going to change that to arg from and arg to. And I'm going to pass that value into the function. Why do I consider that an improvement? What is the advantage of passing the from and to currency type to this function as opposed to just grabbing the value from the drop-down? That's where I'm getting the value for those arguments. So what difference does it make if I grab the value of the arguments here from the drop-down, or I just reference the drop-down here?
Does it decrease the amount of traffic back to the client?
Not really.
Memory,
Not really.
Other things could use the function.
Other things could use the function. In other words, the way this is written, this would require the page that this is on to have a drop-down called DD from and DD2. That's the only way that we could do this. In other words, what if I change the user interface to use radio buttons instead of drop-downs on this page? Then that function's going to have to change, right? It's better instead to have each function be self-contained, all right? In other words, the function doesn't know anything about the outside world. The outside world being the code that's going to call it. The function simply takes its arguments and returns the value. That's called a black box. All right? Black box in electrical engineering has known inputs and a known output. And from the user's perspective, and by user I don't mean end user, I mean the person that's calling the function, they don't care what it does in the middle as long as it produces the output given the proper inputs. So, if I have this to refer to the values of the drop-down, then it's tethered very tightly to the user interface. It's bound to the user interface. It's coupled to the user interface. That's the word I'm looking for. All right? We want our functions to be loosely coupled. By loosely coupled, we mean that they're going to communicate only through arguments to the function and return values. Thinking ahead, we're going to move this function somewhere else so that it can be called by any web page in our application. Will all of those applications have a drop-down? No. They might not have any user interface. We might just make a table that says that $1 is this many pounds, this many euros, $2 is this many pounds, this many euros, and so on. So we may not even have, all right, a user interface to speak of where we're pulling the from and to from currency. We may get the from and to another way, all right? So, we don't want to have the function depend on the fact that there's a drop-down on the page. We want everything that the function needs to be passed to it as an argument. So, what do we need to convert the amount? Well, we need to know what amount we're talking about. We need to know the from currency and the to currency. All right? If we have that, then we can go and calculate the rate first and then calculate the amount. Is everyone clear about that? That's important. That's critical why we do that. And it'll become even more apparent when we go and we move this code into a class of its own. Now the other thing I did is there used to be a line in here that said something that converted amount equals rate times amount. I took that out of there. That's the boss trying to get their hands into someone else's work and trying to do their job for them. And we know that that's not a good idea, right? There should be a function. The boss function should simply gather inputs, call other functions, and display the results. When I had the multiplication happening in the event handler, then that event handler logic was doing some of the calculation. It was getting the rate and doing the multiplication. It makes it much more reusable, and it's better if instead we say, okay, the boss function is only interested in gathering the input, delegating that calculation to someone else, then taking the result and doing something with it. So really, that event doesn't have much code in it. And that's a good thing. Shouldn't be a lot of code in the event handler. And the code that's there shouldn't be doing the heavy lifting. Shouldn't be doing the real work. What should it be doing? It should be gathering the input that you need. All right. Here we're grabbing the value of the amount from the text box. It should call the appropriate function, which is what we're doing here. And then finally, it should take the results that get created and do something with them. In this case, it's displaying it on a text. But keep in mind, that's what it's doing in this case. In other cases, it may take the converted amount and add it to some kind of total. Let's say we were doing a shipping calculation and we calculate the shipping rate in dollars and we convert it to euros. Well, we may need to take those euros, it's the shipping amount, and add it to the total amount for the order, so that we have the total amount of the order in euros. Okay? The function doesn't care where the values came from, and it doesn't care where the values or the answer goes. You give it the input parameters, it does its thing, and returns a result. Whoever calls that function is responsible for gathering up the input, calling the appropriate function, and then doing something with the output. All right? So these functions are now self-contained. So they're better functions than they were before. That is, this function doesn't refer to anything on the page. This function only refers to the arguments and internal variables, and then it communicates the answer back via the return. Is everyone clear on the difference between defining a function and calling a function? Okay? These statements are what define the function. This specifies what we do when we call this function. When we define a function, we need to define the return type, the name of the function, and what kind of arguments we're going to give that function. Those arguments are placeholders. In other words, when this is run and we call it, we're going to call this function and give it a value for ARG amount. Whatever our first argument is will be put into ARG amount. Our second argument will be put in ARG from, and our third argument is going to be put in ARG2. Now notice that I could have combined all this into a couple functions. But I kind of like it like this because this gives me more flexibility. Maybe I only want to know the rate and I don't want to actually do a conversion, in which case I can ask for the rate to convert dollars to euros. And I can do that without actually doing some sort of calculation. Up here, on the other hand, is where we're actually calling the function. Here is where we're giving values to it. In other words, we give the value for the amount, which came from where? Came from that text box. We're given the drop-downs from selected value, the drop-down to selected value. So these get put into these arguments just right in order, and we do the calculation. Questions about this?
I keep on looking at what you're displaying, which is the converted amount.
Mm-hmm.
But that's still, but it's still working. I was like, yeah, but I just thought.
Repeat that?
I was just looking at it, but I just wasn't looking far enough. But because I was looking at the results box, and I was wondering if that would still display what it was supposed to, but yes, it will. So.
Yes, it will. How will it? Well, we're going to define a variable in here called converted amount. Converted amount equals what? Well, we're going to call this function called convert amount. We're going to grab the amount from the text box, we're going to grab the value of the first drop down, the value of the second drop down. That's going to call this function. So what does this function do? First thing this function does is it calculates the rate by calling this function. We're delegating. We don't have to have all the code in one function. So we get the value of the rate. We take that rate, whatever it is, multiply it by the argument for the amount, and return that result. So whatever gets returned here as a result gets put in that converted amount value, and therefore then will get put in a string. There's one more thing I'm going to do. This from and to should actually be an integer, shouldn't be a string. I should do the conversion up there, because really that's what this function wants. So I'm going to convert it to an integer.
Change the variable.
By doing this now, I don't need to do this conversion in here. I do need to do this conversion up here. So, really the only thing I did is I changed the type of is where I did the conversion. In my mind, from a purist perspective, the function should have the data types of the arguments of what it really wants. This really wants to have an integer as the argument. Therefore, it's the user interface's job to convert what it has, that is a string, into an integer. Let's run this through debug. Okay? Because remember, debug is what you can use if something goes wrong with your code. In other words, if you get the wrong answer. All right? You can run debug and you can trace through and see exactly what's happening at all times. So to make sure that we understand this, let's run this through debug. All right? So I'm going to put a breakpoint here. I'm going to run this. And I'm going to put in the from amount, dollars, convert to pounds. I click convert. Oh. It's now at that statement. By hovering my mouse over it, I can see the value of that variable. So is valid is indeed true, which means it passed all validation tests, which I would have imagined it. F11 will allow me to step into the next instruction, and it will allow me to step in the function calls. So I'm going to hit F11 once. All right. We're now initializing a converted amount to 0. We now call this statement, which says amount equals convert to double txt amount. If we look, what is txt amount? It is a text box. And the text property of it has a value of 11. All right? So that's what we typed in the text box. What value does amount have? Amount has a value of 0. Why? Because when it points to that instruction, it hasn't executed it yet. So amount doesn't have a value of 0 yet. If I hit F11 to go through and repeat that, now amount does have a value of 11 because it executed that statement. All right. We can also follow the variables down here and see what values they have. All right, we're now going to call the function convert amount, and we're going to pass it the amount, which is 11, the selected value, which is 0 of the from, the selected value of the 2, which is 2, the selected value of the TO is TWO, all right, and we're going to call that function. All right, so we're passing it the amount that we pulled from the form and the from and to which we pulled from the form. I'll hit F11. We're going into that function now. Remember, we declared the function this way, and now we're calling it. So we're invoking it with specific values, with specific parameters. What are those parameters? Arg amount, which is 11, arg from, which is 0, and arg to, which is the number 2. So I can step through F11. We're now calling this rate equals get arg from and to. All right. So we go into that function. We grab the from, the to rate, we do our calculation, and then we're going to return the rate. And notice that the rate is 0.63, which it is. That's the conversion rate between dollars and pounds. So we return 0.63, which is our conversion rate. Where does that go to? It goes into the variable rate. Why? Because we said get rate, arg from and to. We're going to store the result of that. That is, we're going to store the return value in the variable rate. So, when we're done here, rate has a value of 0.63. Why does it? Because that's the answer we returned. That's the answer this guy returned. Now, some people think, again, and again, keep in mind some of you have been doing functions for a while, so this is review. Some of you may be newer to functions. All right, it's important to understand this. Some people wonder why this is called conversion rate and why this is called rate. Well, a variable that's declared in a function only has scope within that function. In other words, this guy up here, this function up here, doesn't know what conversion rate is. And even if it did, it wouldn't be a good idea to use it. Because remember, we want to make these functions black boxes. Give it a known input, get a known output. Give it the inputs it needs to do its job, get an answer back. And the answer to a function, the result of the function, is the return value. So whatever gets returned by this function, where does it go? It goes into the variable rate. So now rate has a value of 0.63, which we multiply by result to get our answer, which is 6.93. And then we return that answer. We return it to who? To whoever called it, which is this guy up here. So now, converted amount has a value of 6.93. Why? Because I said converted amount equals the value of that function. Another way of saying that is when we call a function, the value of that function is the return value. So we said that this variable equals the results of this function. That is the return value. So that's 6.93. What are we going to do with it? We're going to take that and stick it in the label called labels result new dot text. And we convert it to string because the text box needs strings. All right? And we are all done. And sure enough, there's our answer on the screen. Questions about that?
The component in the definition where you have result equals rate times argument, excuse me, arg amount. How are you defining the arg amount component there?
The arg amount is the argument that gets passed in here.
Okay.
So in other words, this function, the button click event, calls the function convert amount.